If you're looking for the world's best CBD products, look no further than PalomaVerdeCBD.com, a like-minded business out of San Antonio, Texas, owned by a great couple, Carlos and Vanessa. They love the show. They're supporting the show. They're giving you a discount when you buy these products because you like this show. We'll get there at the end here, but I've been ranting and raving about the sports cream for a long time. It is the best. I genuinely mean that. So if you're sore from workouts, go check out the CBD Menthol Sports Cream. If you're having trouble sleeping, they've got the Sleep Bundle CBD Pack. Maybe you've got pets like I do, like my two French bulldogs, Lux and George, that experience inflammation in some part of their spine or their back legs or whatever. Well, look no further. They've got the pet tinctures and the CBD dog chews over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Do you have anxiety at all? Well, there's CBD gummies over there. Are you stressed after a long day? There's CBD bath bombs over there. They've got this new CBD massage oil. Carlos, one of the owners of Paloma Verde, keeps asking me if he can use it on me. I've not allowed him to do so yet, but I suspect that their CBD massage oil is quite amazing. So go check that out. All things CBD related, you will find at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And since they support this show and they want to help the listeners of this show get a discount, I've got a promo code for you. It's BUCK, B-U-C-K. Just enter that at checkout. You will get 20% off of your order. That is BUCK, B-U-C-K at checkout over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Tell them I sent you and enjoy the products. I know you will.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you with me here this week. And what a weekend I just had at the Childerberg event. Such a great, fun event. It's just about an hour and a half away, which is nice too. And they did some comedy and some music over at the Iron Wolf Distillery, which was right near the campground that we all stayed at. And my friend Rachel performed, and my friend Robbie the Fire Bernstein, my friend Kyle Ruff. It was great to see all of them do their thing, the comedy on stage, and went back to the camping area. And I have to say, when it's almost 100 degrees here in Texas, I've now discovered the RV is the way to go when you're going to camp. The AC was blasting. It was amazing in there. I was with my friend Matt Erickson, who you all know from the King Pilled Show. Pete Quinones was out there hanging with us. It was a very good time. I met a lot of new people, which was very cool. And I had fun hanging with everyone. And this morning, Pete and I did Robbie the Fire's podcast. So you can catch us on there. That was a good time. Really fun. And those guys that do the Childerberg event, they do a very professional, good job. And they're going to do it again next year. So I'm telling you, you guys should go check it out. And so this episode specifically, I've said this before, but maybe it's just because I keep finding these guests that truly impress me. Now, Dr. Mark McDonald's been on before, and he was excellent. And that was back in January when we talked about the mass formation psychosis that kind of swept over this country, if not the world, with COVID. This interview is one of my favorites. This one packs a punch. We'll say that. Dr. Mark McDonald, like I said, is here. And I get his Substack where he sends out an email. I think it's about once a week where he's got some of his writings and just kind of gives his thoughts on a topic of the day. And it's always very good. And there was a line in this latest Substack article that he put out, and it caught my eye. And I thought, what a perfect line. And it so encapsulates a phenomenon that we all see everywhere. Miserable women and cowardly men. I know you guys know what I'm talking about. It's out there. It's ubiquitous. And unfortunately, these people, I say pathetic. I don't like to say words that harsh, but we'll say cowardly men, miserable women. They're starting to shape politics and shape some of the rules that the rest of us have to go by. We certainly saw that over 2020. in 2021. So this is a very powerful, impactful discussion. I mean that. And Dr. Mark McDonald, what a badass. I mean, I'm going to put it simply. And I want to get right to it because it's so good. And I'll give you a quick little intro on Dr. Mark McDonald. Let's see, he's trained in both adult and child and adolescent psychiatry at UCLA. He now works primarily with children in private practice in West Los Angeles. He's lived and worked in Europe, Asia, Central America. His opinions on topics such as the need to reopen America's schools and the pandemic of fear in the United States today have been widely published in local and national news, including the Wall Street Journal and the Federalist, and like I mentioned, on Counterflow, just back here in January. So stoked to have him on here with us again. Dr. Mark McDonald, welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, I had you on before, and I got a ton of positive feedback, so I'm happy to get you back on here. For my new listeners, real quick, can you just kind of give a brief intro, who you are, what you do, and that kind of thing?
So I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work in private practice in Los Angeles. I have for about 12 years. And about 2 years ago, I became very active in public speaking and writing to address problems that I saw, particularly with children, regarding mask mandates, shot mandates, school shutdowns, et cetera. And then ultimately began my own podcast, Informed Dissent, in fall of 2020, and then published a book in November of 2020 called United States of Fear: How America Fell Victim to a Mass Delusional Psychosis. And I continue to speak and write on subjects related to government intrusions into liberties and the intersection of healthcare and politics while maintaining my private practice.
I love that you just mentioned it. It's a tagline on your Substack, the intersection of healthcare and politics. And there's a new piece, or newish, I should say, by the time we've done this, but it was on toxic masculinity. And the topic for me is the perfect intersection between medicine and politics. And there's a line in your Substack piece that it hit the nail on the head completely for me. And it was, miserable women and cowardly men. As a society, we have allowed this group to define our current social norms. And I think if a lot of people like me are like me, you're looking around and you see this everywhere, constantly. And so that spoke volumes. Just reading that line alone, I want to get into this topic. What on earth is going on with this phenomenon of miserable women and cowardly men? And I suspect one leads to the other, although I'm not sure which one goes first in this order. But I'd like to get your thoughts generally on this, and then we can certainly get into the weeds as well.
Well, it is a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. But in my book, I outlined the beginning of what I saw as the collapse of the healthy feminine. And that really began with the advent of the modern feminist movement. I'm not referring, when I say to the feminist movement, to the voting rights movement before the Second World War. I'm referring to the modern feminist movement that started really in the late 60s, early 70s, the second wave feminism, which became third wave, which became fourth wave, which became postmodern feminism, et cetera, et cetera. That movement really had nothing to do with equality. It had nothing to do with legal equality between men and women. Men and women for decades now have had equal legal rights to work, to vote, to travel, to be educated. There's absolutely no distinction in our law code and even in our political embodiment of political practice between men and women in terms of equality. That movement really pushed a different direction, which was competition with men and an attack on the feminine itself. In other words, we need women to be more like men so that we can replace them and then show that we don't really need them after all. And that had nothing to do with the early equal rights movement in the United States. The problem with this is that it's inherently laced with toxicity because it defines the relationship between men and women as one that's primarily one of competition, as opposed to complementarity and partnership. And that's a really bad footing to start with in any kind of negotiation between two parties. That has unfortunately devolved into something incredibly damaging, which today we see the results of, I believe, in the entire attack on the sexes themselves, the transgender movement, for example, and transgender activism, the push to remove male and female from language, from clothing, from bathroom codes, from schools, from life itself. That's really the outgrowth of the attack on the distinctions between the sexes. And I believe it really did start with the modern feminist movement. That has also, unfortunately, led to a cultural shift where men have now been demonized, not for being violent or for being abusive, which is appropriate and correct, but for simply being men themselves. So masculinity has now become inextricably tied with the term toxic. So there is no healthy masculinity anymore. There's only toxic masculinity. And so for cultural, political, legal, social reasons, many, many men now in the United States have backed away from expressing and inculcating masculinity in their lives. And what that means practically is that they no longer express and display leadership, courage, strength, the containment of the hyper-emotionality of the feminine, which is a core trait of the feminine. It's not a bad trait, but it does need to be balanced against a more passive and dispassionate state, which is the masculine. And when you take all of that away, when you have someone pushing against a wall that's now been removed, what happens? That person falls over on his or her face, in this case, her face. And it's what we wind up with, and what we saw in the last couple of years, literally screaming, hysterical harpies running around the country, which were called Karens, trying to take over for the lack of power and structure and safety that they felt in their community, because all of the men had disappeared. All of the men had retreated. They had all hidden away, covering their faces with their masks and hiding their heads in their hands, and waiting then for the women to take over, to fill that power vacuum, which of course women are not designed to do. Women are not designed to stay in a chronic position of pressure, of strength, of control. They are meant to jump in when necessary, but they're not meant to subsume the masculine. So when you take away one side or the other, you wind up with an imbalance. You attack the masculine, it retreats. Now you have a vacuum. Women jump in, they become hysterical, they lose it. We have this entire vicious circle of the collapse of society, because at its foundation, our society is based on male and female, man and woman, husband and wife, which of course leads to children, which leads to family, which leads to community. You take away the sexual differences and you really don't have anything left to support your foundation of society on. And then everything from there just starts to crumble. And I think if we had had this crisis, so-called pandemic crisis, 20 or 30 years ago, we wouldn't have seen this. The reason why it really took effect had nothing to do with health or medicine. It had to do with the rotting undercore of our society. We had parasites in our structure, our foundational structure of our home, that had been growing and gnawing away at the wood for so long that when it felt a stress, when the pandemic jumped on top of the wood, just collapsed, and we just fell through it into a pit. And that's, I think, where we are now.
I got to tell you about the wildest, weirdest, coolest, most funny sponsors I have. It's kind of like a 2-in-1. It's the Liberty Tree podcast and the Liberty Tree clothing line, which I absolutely love. We're going to talk about that in a second. As for this podcast, can you beat this description? It's kind of like if Shane McGowan did man on the street interviews in rural Northern California, and after that content was picked up by CNN, it was then analyzed on Sunday mornings by really intelligent, albeit half in the bag, but nonetheless good-looking construction workers. There you go. How about that? What they love: liberty, free speech, Western culture, family, breakfast beers, guns, training to kill with their bare hands, and, like myself, really, really bad jokes. What they are not: statists, progressives, and, well, funny. A few highlights from their podcast include episode 5, where they teach the principles of free driving and talk about how it might just save the world. Most of their predictions have come true. The one they are still tracking and updating regularly is Justin Trudeau's apparent transition. Episode 16 comes out of the gate with really strong joke about a deer that anyone can memorize and use at a party. See there? Thank you for your service. Much like this show, episodes come out every Tuesday with bonus episodes and interviews mixed in here and there. As for this clothing line that I was mentioning earlier, I love it. It's the Liberty Tree Lifestyle. They are subversive fashions for free thinkers and lovers of liberty. Now, as for the websites, and of course, you get a discount code. Wait till you hear about this discount code too. The apparel site is libertytreelifestyle.com, and that's where I got the old world order shirt that I have. I've had several people comment on that. Well, you know where you can get it? You can get it over at libertytreelifestyle.com. Their podcast is at libertytreepodcast.org. That is libertytreepodcast.org. And I told you I've got a promo code. Back to, what these guys aren't is funny. Check out the promo code. It will get you 10% off. Counterflow with Buck Johnson. All one word. Counterflow with Buck Johnson will get you 10% off of your order. Go over to libertytreelifestyle.com and libertytreepodcast.org. Tell them I sent you and get some of those cool shirts over there at libertytreelifestyle.com. Let's get back to the show. Is it the pandemic that you're alluding to? Is that what kind of made it seem to just blossom all of a sudden like it is? It reminds me of the question, how did you go broke? Slowly, and then all at once? Because I don't know if it's that I'm older and maybe more mature, although that's arguable to some people. I haven't noticed this except for maybe, I almost want to say the Trump election seemed to spur a lot of the craziness with this phenomenon of angry, unhappy women and beta men, basically. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I suppose it was 2020 and 2021. But like you alluded to again with the modern feminist movement, I guess it's been just kind of this simmering thing for a little bit, and now the pressure cooker has exploded. When did you see this at its worst?
Well, I had sensed this coming from way before the pandemic in 2020 because I saw it with my patients. I have a lot of children, adolescents, teenage, college patients, one of whom had been essentially ostracized and banned from his university. This was 4 or 5 years ago because of a rape allegation that was levied against him by a very mentally disturbed young woman who he had slept with. She was apparently intoxicated, although it wasn't clear at the time, not with alcohol, but actually with prescription drugs that she was using to calm down her anxiety. And because of the shame and humiliation she felt and confusion after the voluntary sexual encounter, she wound up being encouraged by her friends and family to file a rape case against him. And this boy's life has been forever changed since then. That happened way before 2020. And this has happened across college campuses all over the country. Women have been not just allowed, but encouraged to use the excuse of toxic masculinity as a way to evade their own responsibility and culpability for their own mistakes. And this has been really very convenient. It's provided a lot of cover for the problems inherent in the feminine. Look at the Amber Heard trial right now. It's Johnny Depp. This has been an incredible expose on the toxic femininity in our country. And it's so over the top now that most women actually are turning against Amber Heard, which is a good thing. It's a good thing for people to be held accountable for their extremism. She is a violent, deranged sociopath. And she has victimized Johnny Depp. And I'm not saying he's not culpable, but I'm saying she really is the aggressor here. And now the tables are being turned and she's being revealed to be the actual predator. And he's primarily the victim, although when there are drugs and alcohol involved, it's always hard to really sort things out. But she is inherently mentally ill. And until recently, that was simply brushed away. And all of her actions and her cruelties were explained by saying that toxic masculinity had led her to become temporarily unhinged, but it's really ultimately the man's fault. I saw that kind of thing going on years and years ago. It just wasn't quite as blatant, over the top, as unapologetic. It was kind of on the margins. And it could have raised my eyebrow whenever I heard and saw it, but it hadn't really taken over. It really became exposed, I think, in the beginning of 2020, when the social norms became publicly redefined. And I said this in my new book, which is coming out in a month or two. It's in production now. It's called Freedom from Fear: How to Overcome the Fear Addiction for an Individual and National Recovery. And one of the lines in my book is, we have allowed our social norms to be determined by the most fearful among us rather than the most courageous.
Yes.
And right now, the most fearful are really women, and they are hysterical. Now, men, of course, are lacking in courage. Absolutely true. I'm not leading them off the hook here whatsoever. But when you allow a large contingent of very fearful people to redefine your norms, especially when you allow them to redefine them in a way that protects them from their own mistakes and their own shame, that's a terrible motivation for corruption. And we have been corrupting our girls for a very, very long time, telling them that they really have nothing that they can do wrong. And that anytime there's a problem, you just turn and blame it on the boy. It's been going on for decades. And now it's become encoded into our legal system, where protections have been taken away for young men who are accused of rape on campuses, and sexual harassment is happening in the workplace now. You're seeing it in language. There are 3 boys in a school, I believe it's a middle school, I think it's in Minnesota, where the boys used the wrong pronoun to speak to a girl in their class who a month prior had decided that she was now a boy. And these 3 boys are now being punished at school. One of them has actually been not fined, but accused of a Title IX Civil Rights Code violation, which, if it sticks, will ban him from being eligible for any college scholarship in 6 years when he graduates from high school for life. All because he said she and her instead of his and him to this biological girl in the classroom. And these kids are like 12 years old. This is happening all over the country right now. So I'm seeing it just exploding, but it really went out of control, I think, in March of 2020. It's only getting worse.
Mm-hmm. There's something I noticed through the 2020 year and 2021. When I had a friend or acquaintance that was a male, and he was weak on standing up about masks and lockdowns, and he would just seem blue-pilled or weak on the issue. Interesting trend, it was that his wife or girlfriend was super upset about COVID. And it always influenced his take, where we would agree on so many things, but when it came to masking your kids and all of this stuff outside, he would crumble to the insane Karen wife who was scared of everything. And I think that's kind of a byproduct of exactly what you're saying.
It is.
Do you ever see this through a conspiratorial lens and think that it's by design ever?
Well, I think this entire calamity of the last 2 years is by design. And I'm not just speaking about the medical aspect of it. I think that was really an opportunistic pile-on. Whether or not that was programmed and detailed down to the encoding of the virus and its release, I honestly don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, but it's hard to prove. What is easy to prove, though, is what followed. There was an opportunity that was seen very quickly by politicians, media, and corporations to use this actual medical issue. And there is a virus. It does infect people. 2 people do get sick and some people die. That's all real. But no more so than in any other recent respiratory illness, and much less than some that are far more serious, like tuberculosis, for example. And because people now are so connected to news, phones, social media, especially one source of it, my Apple iPhone that I have, 2 or 3 days ago, I picked it up in the morning and it went beep, 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 beep. And I thought, oh my gosh, it was an Amber Alert, nuclear holocaust. I looked at the phone and there was an Apple push news notification, which I can't turn off. You can't get rid of them. And it said, click here to listen to the disinformation being propagated about the newest viral scare coming into our country. And it was a 1-hour audio podcast to explain to everyone why we needed to be afraid of monkeypox and why anything that said otherwise was already disinformation. This is literally within 24 hours of the monkeypox story breaking over the weekend. They're already preempting our thoughts of, gosh, maybe this is actually a sexually transmitted disease in raves out of Belgium that really doesn't have much to do with my life, so that we can then, as we did 2 years ago, start to go down the path of we're all going to die unless fill in the blank. And that blank is always that we give up one more of our liberties. Mm-hmm. So I think that from 2.5 years ago to last Thursday or Friday, this entire past 2.5 years has all been planned. It's all been organized by a small group of people, powerful corporations and media, to take advantage of a scare using the tools that we have now become completely addicted to, which are primarily cell phones in our pockets. We can't even leave our home with it. People are using them in the bathroom. And through that device, we are being told what to think, how to think, and certainly what not to think and how not to think. And that molds our way of seeing the world. It molds our perceptions in the context of becoming more and more scared and chronically terrified, which then makes it even more easy for our brains to become controlled, for us to become malleable, because we're not able to go out and sit in a coffee shop with our friends and say, I'm really scared. And the other person says, honestly, there's nothing to be scared about. We're going to be fine. Oh, I'm overreacting. Thank you. Reality check. We don't have reality checks because we're all sitting at home, all getting the same feed, and nobody is reality checking one another. We're not looking outside even to see if there's bodies in the street. We're being told that there are. And then we don't even want to look because it's too terrifying. So I think that there's a lot of detail in this, and you can talk about this for a long time, but I think the easiest way to conceptualize it is that people are psychologically driven to accept in times of crisis the offering of a powerful leader who will provide them with security and safety and reassurance on the altar of sacrifice. And people are willing to sacrifice just about anything if they're scared enough. And there's a lot of very smart but very devious and evil people who know this. It doesn't need to be a conspiracy. It doesn't need to be a cabal of people with black coats sitting underground in a chamber. It just has to be some group of people with the power, the will, and the lack of values to push this with the reward and promise of more power and more money. And you can see from the evidence, $1 billion of gross revenue per day was achieved for the first time by a corporation in the history of the world during the pandemic by Amazon. $1 billion of gross revenue per day. Why? Because Amazon, the media, and the politicians all colluded with one another, which is the definition of fascism, to shut down all of the competition. So now you couldn't go and buy anything in a store. You had to use Amazon. How convenient. Same thing with all of the companies that manage the pharmacies. Once you have 2 or 3 monopolies on pharmacies, you can't go to a competitor to get the drugs you need. So you have to go to Walmart and Walgreens, and they all told you can't get the drugs you need because they're all toxic. So you just have to suffer at your home and go to the hospital. And when you go to the hospital, of course, the hospital's not going to treat you. They're going to encourage you to become more sick and put you on a ventilator because it earns them another $35,000 in payments from Medicare, which is guaranteed by the federal government, which is the one setting the rules for the pharmacies and the hospitals. The whole thing, like I said, it's not a conspiracy. It's just a bunch of people all realizing that they can rub each other's backs and they all get a benefit from it at the expense of the American people.
Yes, precisely. Well, wonderfully put. Yeah, you don't have to be in a dark, smoky room with 5 people when instead you can have an incentive, a structure of incentives that people with power take advantage of. There's a lot of people that are considering getting the heck out of the United States these days. It was COVID tyranny. It still is in a lot of places, but who knows? Maybe it's climate change tyranny coming next. If that's you and you're thinking about exploring life in another country, I've got an amazing resource to share with you, and that would be the Expat Money Show, hosted by Mikkel Thorup. Whether it's foreign residencies, second passports, asset protection, or just protecting your money from the tyranny of taxation, there is no better resource than the Expat Money Show. That is for certain. Mikkel has spent over 20 years traveling the world, visiting more than 100 countries while living in 9 different countries over that time. He can help you legally eliminate your tax bill and travel the world in the process. So, doesn't that sound fun? It is pretty damn appealing, I gotta admit. Subscribe to the Expat Money Show today, available on podcatchers everywhere, YouTube, or just head over to expatmoneyshow.com.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that you see young people all the way up through their teens. This is something I don't know as well. I don't have kids yet, and I'm not around teens very often, but it does seem that they have issues communicating with each other. Do you see that more? And maybe it's, I don't know if their heads are in their phone all of the time, or how is this manifesting itself with teens?
They don't communicate at all. When they come into my office, they don't look at me. They don't make eye contact. Until recently, they were all wearing masks and mumbling. They weren't enunciating. Their heads are permanently tilted forward to look down at their lap where they're holding their phones. They communicate with what I would call Egyptian hieroglyphics, facial expressions, emojis, fruits, vegetables, fire, rain. I mean, this really looks like something you'd see in a cave. we've reduced our vocabulary to what can be supplied by Apple. And that includes pictures of men with babies in their wombs. So when you control language and you simplify language from whatever it is, 40,000 different words in the basic English vocabulary, down to 400 photos, all of which are written by people and designed by people to push political messages, then you are literally controlling the minds of the person, of the reader, of the person on the phone. And young people, they don't have any experience with even writing. Most of them don't even know how to use a pencil or a pen to write anything except block characters. They cannot actually handwrite. They're not taught this anymore. All they do is they don't even type. They just use their thumbs to insert pictures into their phones and things like CULTR for see you later. They have shorthand now. It's incredibly bastardized. So the vocabulary is so limited. They're not able to think, because words is how we think. We don't think in emojis. We think in words. And when we take our words away, our thoughts are taken away. I can't really overestimate or over speak about this, how debilitating this is for the basic tools of communication. And so you take that away, you remove the tools, and then you add in all of the isolation, you add in all of the devices that distance ourselves physically from others, you remove the presence physically of being able to touch and see and hear other people, the physical contact, because that's all been banned, it's all too dangerous. And now what you've got is just a whole bunch of isolated minds that have all been diluted out with very little information and words to express themselves, all being push-fed information and being prompted to respond to queries that come from bots and other algorithms on their phones. You know, most of these kids, they're not even communicating with each other. They're communicating with photographs of girls and boys and people trying to sell things to them. You know, women selling lotions by dancing around and then telling them to click on the link to go to their website and buy something, and they get money from it. This is not social interaction. This is really mind control. And I see it in all of the children, all of the teenagers that I have. The teenagers now are not going out, and they're not meeting with friends. They're not dating. They're not really playing sports that much. They're not organizing themselves in coffee shops and talking. When they do get together, they pull their phones out and they start chatting with other people or other computers somewhere else. So there's no sense of physical presence. This is something I've never seen before. I've never heard of this before, and it's all just blown up in the last 5 to 10 years. It started with the iPhone in 2007, iPhone 1, and it's just gotten exponentially worse ever since then. In the last 2 years, it's probably doubled in terms of its severity.
Are dating apps something that causes harm on the population at large? Again, it's something I never had an experience with, but it seems cold, the whole way it works. But again, I don't know. I don't use them. Does that have an effect negatively on the mind of society?
I think they're very destructive. I'll give you an example. I have a patient who's in his late 20s who is very disconnected from the physical society, the social society of Los Angeles, where I live and work, for a variety of reasons. And although he is very well educated, he's very physically fit, he's a kind, thoughtful person, he doesn't see the possibility anymore, because the last 2 years we've all been closed down, of actually meeting a woman that he can date. He just doesn't see it as possible. So he only uses apps. And every week he comes to see me, he scrolls through the app and he tells me, I just spent another 2 hours earlier today trying to get girls to talk to me on the app, and nobody will talk to me. Or I got a girl to talk to me on the app, but then she cut me off and she didn't want to go out. And every single rejection, every single cancellation reinforces the belief that he is never going to be loved. He's never going to be desired. He's not worth anything. And this type of experience of young men just endlessly going through photographs and images, trying to chat with girls and being rejected, provides them with a very false sense of reality, a warped sense of themselves. It's also very unhealthy for the girls, because the girls who are on these apps, they don't use them to actually gain relationships. They use them to gain validation. How many men clicked on my profile? How many men liked my photos? How many men think I'm pretty? I got a 50 today. I feel really good. Nobody did it today. I feel awful. So their entire sense of self-valuation becomes linked to this unstable, volatile, hyper-responsive, male presence on their dating apps. And they don't actually have the real feedback that they get from actual face-to-face conversations with men. So they're not able to really evaluate their own self and decide what type of values they actually have for themselves and how much they are valued. So it warps the experiences, the self-esteem of both the men and the women. It prevents normal social engagement. It turns everything into a very quick and easy and superficial exchange, which takes away the possibility of depth and getting to know other people. And it ultimately just leads to isolation. Now, you could say that it leads to a lot of quickie sex encounters. And I think to some extent that had been true in the past. But all of the research that I've seen said that the teenagers and young adults now are actually having less sex than at any time in previous generations. Now, I'm not trying to push everybody to go and have meaningless one-night stands on the weekends, but I think it's important to note that if this were such a so-called successful dating app, you would think that there'd be even more sex happening. But there's actually even less, which reinforces my belief that the apps are not generally today being used for that. They're being used for validation on the part of the women and this hopeless quest by men to try to see if a woman will like them.
Something that's been disheartening to see is some people I've known in this situation, a little bit on the progressive side, female, maybe in their 20s and 30s, ran with some type of subculture or feminist scenes and this kind of thing. Maybe even not hyper political women, but into the left-leaning, left-wing scene. And all of a sudden, they're in their 40s and they look around and it feels to them that there's no real men left and there's no real men around them to date. And they start thinking, I wish I had a family. And some of the things that might be contra to their earlier thoughts on society and families and men and women. Do you see patients like that? Or I guess they're not your patients because at this point they'd be in their 40s. Maybe it's the parents. I don't know. But do you see that as a trend too? Women that think I wasted some years being in this hypersensitive feminist political circles. And now I'm looking around thinking that I'm surrounded by beta males and I can't find an actual real man.
I see it all the time. I see it even with young women who are trying to date and saying, I can't find any real men. Where did they go? Women who are older are not just confused and forlorn, they're actually bitter. The young women who can't find dates, they just feel sort of frustrated. They feel alone. They feel tired of looking for something that they can't seem to locate. But the older women, they're bitter and they're angry because they have followed this path that they were told by the feminists and by the universities and the media and most non-conservative politicians who have said, forget about men. Follow your career. Go after a higher degree. Get a great job. Become financially independent. You can deal with that man stuff later. Well, later becomes 30, becomes 35, becomes 38, becomes 40. And eventually, after a while, they start to say, I'm waking up every morning. I'm going to a job I don't really care about that much anymore. I'm tired. I've got a lot of money, but I don't really feel that there's any sense of meaning or purpose in my life anymore. And I'm seeing my friends who are now married, who have quit their jobs, are working part-time, who've given birth, who are raising children, and they're just delighted. They're so connected with their children and their husband. They're in love with their lives. They have time to rest. They're able to travel. They don't have any of those things, these women who are in their 40s. They're alone. All they have is their money and their dog, maybe their cat. They don't have any relationships. And then this is where it becomes really tragic. They reach a point where it's too late to actually get a family. So they may be able to get married, but maybe not to the man that they had hoped for, probably an older man, a man that doesn't want to have family or kids or is divorced with kids already. They're not able to have their own children, so they have to do in vitro or they have to adopt, which is certainly possible, but it's expensive and it's very heart-wrenching. They may not have those options at all. And so they wind up feeling like they've missed out on the most important aspect of the female human existence, which is to have a child, to be married, to have a family. It got taken from them because they were conned. And then they become very, very angry, bitter, upset. They're not fun to be around. They're miserable. They may wind up, if they can see the light, wind up giving themselves permission to mourn, and then they can actually redirect their passion towards something that's more community oriented. But many of them just double down and they become even more angry at men. They basically displace the anger that they should have towards feminism onto the men, and they think that it's the men's fault because the men didn't give them what they needed. The men should have stepped in and said, honey, you've got to get married. You got to have a kid. Stop with this career stuff. And because that didn't happen, then they get upset with the wrong sex. And I think this is only going to get worse. Simple stat, just a few months ago, we found that for the first time in US history, the average age of a woman giving birth for the first time, 30 years old. That is the oldest age in US history. Median age of the firstborn child of a mother, it's 30 years for the mother. Well, after age 30, generally speaking, fertility begins to decline very rapidly. By 35, you have less than a 1 in 5 chance of having a child, naturally. By the time you're 38, 39, it's 10 to 20%. Over 40, it's less than 10. So you don't have a lot of time once you hit 30 to get your act together. And a lot of women are just cruising along, not bothering to think about it until they hit their mid to late 30s because they were told not to. And now they're alone, they're angry, they're miserable, and they're never going to be fully productive in the way that they had hoped for, being part of a family structure, being a wife and mother.
And here in Texas, that's when they stick that Beto O'Rourke sign in their yard. I had to take that one shot. I keep picturing people like this that I see around. I'll get you out of here. I have to respect your time. I'm so honored to have you on here. In closing, if there's folks listening to this show that are maybe in the dating world and they're lamenting, again, their sad pool of options, which we kind of agree that that's kind of what exists, or even if they're married and maybe their spouse is lackluster or a low testosterone male or an angry woman that's caught up in something or other. Do you have any advice for people like this? I hate to see people settle and assume like, well, this is just how things are. I'm screwed. Do you have any advice for these types?
I do. I think it's different for men and for women, but I think that both sexes can do something to help reverse this trend and also protect themselves. For the men, I advise and strongly encourage men to express strength, to express courage, to stand up for their values, their opinions, to push back vocally and strongly when they're told that they're being toxic, when they're told that they need to apologize for hurting somebody's feelings because what they said, although truthful, made someone uncomfortable, particularly if it's a woman, and to give no notice, no respect, no nickel whatsoever to this kind of attack and defamation of character of the actual natural man. This sets an example, not just for themselves, but also for the rest of society. It also will make them known and available to be seen by women who are looking for real men. If you just sit there and say nothing, your silence conveys everything. And the women in the room will not know, is this man silent because he agrees or is he silent because he just doesn't dare to object? And then they'll turn and walk away. For the women, what the women should do is they should stand up vocally against the same nonsense. They should stand up when a woman says, oh my gosh, that guy the other day, he gave me this compliment and said I was attractive. And I just told him to go F himself, toxic masculinity. Those women should stand up and say, don't say that to a man. Accept the compliment gracefully. He's expressing his masculinity. He's taking a risk to show you that he's a man, that he thinks that you're attractive, and perhaps that he desires you. You should take that compliment gracefully. And those women who are hearing all of this nonsense, they need to step away from it and they need to stand up and say, I, as a woman, believe something else. I want real men. I want real courage. They need to also, as the men do, to express their beliefs and their values that go against this ridiculous toxic narrative. And then they will be visible to those other men. What I want to see is both sexes coming out of the closet, so to speak, as traditional men and traditional women, without apologizing, without saying they're sorry, without having to defend themselves. That will spark a complete transformation because at their core, men and women know apart from the absolute far, far left that are completely incorrigible. We're never going to fix them. Those are the ones with Antifa and firebombing places. They're hopeless. They need to be in prison. But everybody else, they know at their core that there's something wrong. They feel it. They may not be able to express it intellectually, but they know it on some level. And all they really need is a growing movement of people around them to support and validate that feeling. And then this lie, this emperor doesn't have any clothes kind of nonsense will be exposed. We need that one child to stand up and say, he's naked. This movement is naked. And everyone else will say, oh my God, I thought so too. I thought I was crazy. And all of a sudden, the whole thing will collapse because it's biologically the antithesis of what is truthful and real. It's also culturally decrepit. It is unhealthy. It doesn't allow for growth. It doesn't allow for happiness and joy. Most people are not misanthropes. They're not sadists. They're not masochists. Most people are neutral or good to some degree in terms of wanting to protect their self-interest and the interests of society. So if we would stop apologizing and hiding, but standing up, taking a risk and taking some arrows, you're going to be attacked. You're going to be to some degree ostracized and marginalized. But if we all started to do that more, I think this whole thing would collapse and people would get back to what's actually, it's not a political issue, but just a natural, healthy way for men and women to interact, which is the way we've been interacting for hundreds of years until the 50s and 60s. And that's when things started to go downhill. So that's my advice for the sexes is to stand up for what's right, to express your femininity and your masculinity without apology, not only for society, but also for yourself, because you will then be seen and people will come to you of the opposite sex and say, thank God I've been looking for someone just like you. And then it will all be worth it.
Well put. Plug away, please. Social media presence, anything, website, podcast, like you mentioned earlier.
So my book that's out now, which came out in November, is called United States of Fear. And I'm going to be putting out a compendium to that called Freedom from Fear in the next month or two, which will be a 12-step guide to an individual national recovery, similar to AA and Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, outlining how to overcome fear addiction. In the meantime, I do publish a Substack every Thursday, and I also have several podcasts that come out usually around once a week. All of that can be found on my literary website, which is called dissidentmd.com, dissidentmd.com. If you want to go directly to the podcast, you can go to Apple Podcasts and just type in Informed Dissent, and you'll see it pulled up with me and Dr. Jeff Barkey. So there's all kinds of places to listen to the podcast, Informed Dissent, to read about the Substack, which is also called Informed Dissent. Or Dissident MD, is called the Substack account, which is the same as the website. And then the book that's coming out in a month or two. I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to keep speaking out, not because it's making me rich, but because I really believe that the country that I want to see as I get older is not going to be possible unless there are more people speaking out and attacking this evil that's taken over our country and our culture and righting the ship.
Yes, and that Substack, like I mentioned earlier, is so good. I will link to all of this in the show notes page for this episode. Dr. Mark McDonald, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Buck.
Yes, sir. I told you that was a good one. That was a good one. This is one you might want to share with friends, family. I mean, it might get you in trouble, huh? But I mean, seriously, this is a very important topic, and I think Dr. McDonald articulates the issue quite well. And he's almost poetic in his wording sometimes. What a guest. Thanks again for being here. As for this show, you know the scoop. It's over at counterflowpodcast.com when you need to find all the important information. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Buck Rebel. And like I always say, trying to ramp up this YouTube traffic because I neglected it for so long. Subscribe to us on my YouTube page. And it's obviously just search Counterflow with Buck Johnson. You're an adult. You know how to do all that stuff. Hit the subscribe button and you'll get notified. All of these interviews I do, including this one, are a video as well. And so if you want to watch it, if that's how you like seeing these kind of things and hearing them, that's your way to do it. I do live streams on there that are exclusive to the YouTube page that won't show up here in your podcast feed. So go check us out over on the YouTube page. And if you'd like to support this show, if it means that much to you, as little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like, you can do that at patreon.com/counterflow. You guys have an excellent week. Next week's episode is going to be a good one too. Going to be a good one. Until then, you guys have a great week. See ya.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.